How's it going, folks? My name is Jack Miller. I am the incredibly underqualified punk historian, and today I am very excited to be showing you all the first episode in a series that I'm going to do once every year of my top 10 releases of said year. For this first time around, we're of course going to be talking about my top 10 releases from 2023, and we got a lot of wonderful singles, EPs, records from punk rock and punk adjacent genres this past year, and for that reason I found it pretty difficult to condense it down to just 10, and also for that reason you will find a short honorable mentions list towards the end of this video, along with a short list of some local bands from my scene up here in Seattle that I think put out some great releases this year as well. I also feel like for the first time in maybe a couple years we got a very decent variety package from the blanket punk genre this year, and I found myself taking home more records that I really loved than usual, so I'm very excited to be diving into these and sharing them all with you. So without further ado, coming in at number 10, we have Thousand Oaks and their new full-length On a Wing and a Prayer. Now, Thousand Oaks is a metal skate punk band from Rome, Italy, and their record dropped in March of 2023. I have been a casual fan of Thousand Oaks since their 2019 album, Bound for Destruction, but this record is the first time I feel like I've really seriously sat down with their music, and it might be my favorite release from these guys yet. Like I just said, this album is very much at home in the world of metal skate punk or technical melodic hardcore, whatever you want to call it, and it is full of lightning fast drums, tons of noodly guitars, and these really anthemic vocals that come in and out throughout the verses and choruses and bridges. And if you're a fan of Propagandhi, a Wilhelm Scream, or Belvedere, then I would definitely recommend checking this album out. Then in the number 9 slot, we have the band Monk and their 6-song EP, Rock. Monk is a hardcore band from Los Angeles, California, and this EP issued in August of 2023. And they're a little bit of a newer band, and as far as I'm aware of, this EP and the 3 singles they dropped leading up to it are the first ever releases we've ever gotten from these guys. But all of these singles, and especially this EP, are what I would say everything you want in a hardcore release. There's tons of energy from front to back, and every single track feels like an absolute slap in the face with sound. You've got your fast and wild songs, you've also got your slow and heavy songs, but that isn't where things end with this EP, and there's also some melodic elements which sound to me like an influence from early punk, and the track Cool and Collected has what almost seems like a Buzzcock-style chorus in the middle of a hardcore song. But regardless of whatever external influences the band might be channeling, this is very much a hardcore EP, like I said, and if you're a fan of Minor Threat, Bad Brains, The Circle Jerks, or any of the other classic 80s stuff, or even some of the earlier New York hardcore stuff like Sick of It All and Agnostic Front, I would definitely recommend giving this a listen. On to number 8, we have the Dahmers and their 4-song EP, Ghouls in the Garage. The Dahmers are a horror punk band from Kristianstad, Sweden, and this EP dropped all the way back in February of 2023, but I didn't discover it until October when I was working on my horror punk video. And this EP is a ton of fun from front to back. It very much channels that Ramones-y, poppier side of horror punk, and there's also a very clear garage rock influence going on with this thing, and especially so on the production side. The Dahmers also have some very apparent roots in 50s and 60s rock and roll, but I think that's pretty standard for horror punk as we've come to know it over the years. But while we're on the topic of this EP's musical nostalgia, if you will, there's a couple of tracks that utilize some synth leads, which is something, at least from my understanding, that's been largely absent from both horror punk and Ramones core for a pretty long time now. And I really love that retro pop punk vibe this EP has. So if you're a fan of the groovy Ghoulies, Zombina and the Skeletons, Murderland, or even some of the poppier psychobilly bands like The Creepshow, I would say this EP is 100% worth your while. Moving on to number 7, we have the band 214 and their debut full-length, Adrienne's Garden. 214 is a pop-punk band from New York City, and this record released in October of 2023. These guys are another newer band, releasing their first single, Escalator, back in 2022, but I discovered them after the release of their second single, Crystal Ball, which came out way back in January of 2023. And both 214 and their debut full-length are a total throwback to the early 2000s, capturing a very similar energy to the staple names of Drive-Thru Records' roster back in the day. But while that is certainly their very clear foundation, it's definitely not the only thing 214 has to offer, and sandwiched in between every couple of spunky pop-punk tunes, we see the band channel a very apparent emo influence of the same era, and there's a number of tracks on this record that give a nod to bands like Finch, Brand New, or even Taking Back Sunday, which I find to be an incredibly appropriate and welcome shift of pace, considering the band's very obvious roots in what a lot of us probably think of as that genre's sister scene. Despite channeling and truthfully executing quite well what a lot of people probably think of as a bit of an older sound, 214, however, are a much younger band, probably the youngest band on this entire list. And if you ask me, I think that actually might be something that works to their advantage in terms of putting their own spin on something that, in a lot of people's eyes, has already been pretty well fleshed out for a number of years now. Having come of age in an era where not only has this particular breed of pop-punk long since been taking a back seat to some of the genre's more contemporary varieties, but even within this particular breed, there's now a plethora of different discographies for a new listener to delve into as far as influence goes, I would be one to argue that this type of perspective can really aid a younger songwriter's abilities in terms of originality. And if you're a fan of MXPX, early Blink-182, Sum 41, or the Ataris, then I think this record is something you might really like. Coming in at number 6, we have the Public Serpents and their new full-length record, The Bully Puppet. The Public Serpents are a ska punk band from Port Monmouth, New Jersey, and the new record made its first debut in March of 2023. For those of you who don't know, Public Serpents are fronted by former Choking Victim drummer Squirt, and the band, of course, offers a similar grindy, anti-authoritarian take on ska punk. Unlike any of their former bandmates, though, Public Serpents tend to drift a little bit closer to their ska side, and I think especially so on this release. This album features a number of slower, groovier tracks with an added layer of distorted guitars to give things a little bit of an extra push. A number of staple tracks on the Bully Puppet also feature some pretty prominent brass, which I think also speaks to the band's deeper roots in ska. There's also a number of places on this album where the upstrokes are so tight that they sound a little more like a Hammond organ than any kind of guitar. Despite being a little more rooted in ska than their vocalist's more well-known project, though, this record still very much fits in on the more aggressive side of ska punk, and even the more dance-worthy tracks still have a tendency to reflect that. But technicalities aside, like most quality ska punk records, The Bully Puppet is, of course, a whole whirlwind of fun. And although I definitely enjoyed it quite a bit upon my first listen, I found that I liked this record more and more with each spin I gave it. And I would highly recommend this album to anyone who enjoys the likes of Against All Authority, the Suicide Machines, or the Voodoo Glow Skulls. Coming in at number 5, we have one of Australia's favorite punk bands and one of skate punk's most beloved cult favorites, Frenzal Rhomb, and their new album, The Cup of Pestilence. This album made its debut in April of 2023, and Frenzal Rhomb is of course considered a bit of a classic in a lot of punk circles, so I don't think they need too much of an introduction here, but on the same token, I still think it's pretty important to note how remarkably strong their material has remained, despite having been a band for over 30 years at this point. And this record is, of course, no exception to that rule, and it delivers quite the spread of catchy, high-energy tunes, clocking in at a whopping 19 tracks. And to be completely honest with you, every single one of those songs is pretty damn good. Frenzal Rhomb is definitely a band that's really found their niche over the course of the past 10 to 15 years or so, and this record is another perfect example of them absolutely acing their part. Along with its very catchy and infectious nature that we've come to know and love from Frenzal over the years, vocalist Jason Whaley continues to deliver a healthy supply of witty, humorous lyrics throughout its run, and I think that gives these songs a similar sense of balance between comically amusing and sing-along worthy to a lot of their older material. And if you're a fan of other Fat Wreck classics like NoFX, Lagwagon, and No Use for a Name, and you just never got around to checking out Frenzal Rhomb, well, now is a better time than ever to do so because the Cup of Pestilence is right up your alley. Ranking in at number 4, we have the UK's new pop-punk poster children, Neck Deep, and their 4-song EP, We Need More Bricks, which made its first appearance in November of 2023. Much like Frenzal Rhomb, I don't think Neck Deep needs a terribly long introduction, but while we are on that subject, I think it's important to point out that this EP and the singles issued before it see the band return to their signature breed of pop-punk, in contrast to their previous full-length and its more accessible, mainstream-friendly direction. And as far as I'm concerned, and I'm sure a lot of their core fan base is concerned, this is a very welcome and refreshing change of pace. Also, like Frenzal Rhomb, Neck Deep is another band I've been a fan of for quite some time now, having first discovered them through their debut full-length Wishful Thinking back in 2014. And while that of course might explain some of my biases towards their pop-punk material as opposed to what they had been doing just a few years ago, still, this is something that the band feels a lot more at home doing, and I think it's very much reflected in the material on this EP. We Need More Bricks, along with the various singles released just before it, were actually a build-up to the self-titled full-length the band just issued recently here in January of 2024, and I would say both of these releases are definitely worth checking out if you're a fan of pop-punk classics like Blink, Sum 41, and Newfound Glory, but I would also broaden that to some of the more adjacent scenes to pop-punk as well, and even if you're into skate punk or ska punk, I would still say this is something worth checking out. Breaking into the top 3, we have Denmark's Fabled Mind and their 4-song EP, Algorithm. This is another release that is very much at home in the world of metal skate punk and made its first debut in November of 2023. And Algorithm is easily one of the most interesting and intricate releases I came across this year. Rooted, of course, in metal skate punk, but for as technical and experimental of a sound that can be at times, I would still say this is a pretty progressive release. All 4 of its tracks seem to be very carefully pieced together with some really memorable riffing, powerful vocal hooks, and very standalone section structures. This release also presents an exceptionally diverse influence pool, and while of course skate punk of the past decade or so has very much become known to embrace this concept, I would still argue that Algorithm takes this a couple of steps further. Drawing inspiration from what sounds to me like everything from third wave ska to progressive rock to Midwest emo to reggae in places throughout this EP's short run. There's also a number of almost folky transition bits kind of sewn in on the ends or during pace changer sections of a couple of key tracks here. And the fact that the band is able to balance such foreign elements in a pretty well-defined sound on also such a short release and execute it almost perfectly, I think really speaks to their ability as musicians and even more so as songwriters. Much like Neck Deep's EP that we just talked about, Algorithm was released to hype up Fabled Mind's second full-length album, Project Paradise, that just made its debut in January of 2024. And both this EP and the full-length record I would certainly recommend to anyone who considers themselves a fan of metallic skate punk staple players like a Wilhelm Scream scream and propagandy. But just to humor the side of that audience that's already invested in metallic skate punk's more progressive side, which seems to be gaining a lot more traction in real time as we get further and further into the current decade. If you're at all invested in bands like Fair Dues, Forest, or Straight Line, then I'm going to go out on a whim here and say that this EP and the follow-up full-length are definite must-listens if you haven't already. Coming in at number 2, we have the Ramones-core pop-punk band Tightwire and their new full-length Head Full of Snakes. Tightwire is based out of Minneapolis, Minnesota, a city very close to my former place of residence in St. Paul, Minnesota, and the record made its debut in June of 2023. And Head Full of Snakes is what I would consider to be everything a listener would want in a Ramones-core record, and truthfully some of the catchiest pop-punk songs I've heard all year. The band also channels some elements of the gruff pop-punk stuff that seemed to hit its high point in the late 2000s and early 2010s through bands like Off With Their Heads, Banner Pilot, or the Flatliners, and I would say Tightwire absolutely aces that sound just as much as they do the Ramones core style. I also find that Tightwire's gruffer side gives them a little bit of an extra punch that not only sets them aside from other bands in the Ramones core cohort, but also helps their poppier side stand out a little more. And because of that, I think Head Full of Snakes is very much the type of record that just hits you with its punchy energy right out of the gate and absolutely flies by as each track manages to pick up right where the last one left off. Not only is that type of flying by typically a staple piece of some of the best records in this genre, but it's also something that Tightwire executes pretty much perfectly, and this is easily my favorite release I've heard from either of these scenes in a couple of years. And if you're a fan of Screeching Weasel, Teen Idols, The Queers, or even bands like Dillinger 4, Dear Landlord, then I'd say this album is more than worth your while. Before we get to number 1, I do, of course, have to share my honorable mentions with you all, but 2023 gave us so many great punk releases, at least in my opinion, I found this portion even harder to narrow down than the initial top 10. With the first of these, however, I am going to be doing a little bit of shameless self-promotion and talk about Diesel Boy and our new record Gets Old, which came out in July of 2023, right before we did our European tour. Dave, of course, writes all the songs for Diesel Boy, so I can say I like his writing and always have, even before I joined the band in the spring of 2023, but I feel like I would be a little too biased to listen to this album and then rank it amongst others being a member of the band, but I do want to remind you all that this album exists, and we are going to be further promoting it into 2024, and I will have many updates about that to come. Getting into the official honorable mentions, if you will, the second band on the list here is an emo pop-punk band from the UK called As December Falls, and their new full-length record, Join the Club, which also issued in July of 2023. Now, this record is, of course, fantastic, and As December Falls is certainly a band I've grown to expect great things from, as they've quickly built up a catalog of really solid releases over the past 8 years or so. I've actually been a fan of theirs since 2015, but they have certainly grown astronomically since then. I'd say the only reason I have this record a little bit lower is because I didn't think it was quite as strong as the band's previous two full-lengths from 2019 and 2022, but nonetheless, I would still say it's certainly worth a listen, and more or less aces its part, and if you're a fan of My Chemical Romance, Paramore, or Fall Out Boy, then I think you're gonna love this album. After that, we have a band called Seagulls from Atlanta, Georgia, who are another great example of the gruff pop-punk sound popularized in the early 2010s. Their new record goes by the name The Rapture and the Resurgens and debuted in October of 2023. My friends and I actually discovered them at Fest in Gainesville, Florida, and we saw them play at this little dive bar right across the street from the plaza where all the headliners play, and I would say Fest is definitely the perfect place to discover a band like this because Like I said, they totally have that gruff pop-punk sound that the festival has become very well known for hosting. And if you're a fan of Off With Their Heads, Dear Landlord, or maybe even Hot Water Music or Avail, then this record is certainly worth your time. I also found out a couple of those guys are Diesel Boy fans after we saw them play, so that might make me a little biased, but this is definitely a great record nonetheless. And lastly, the fourth entry on our honorable mentions list here is the Smoking Popes and their single Madison, which first debuted in July of 2023. Now, the Smoking Popes are a bit of a cult classic and maybe don't require a terribly large introduction, having been an instrumental piece in the Chicago pop-punk wave that kind of took over that scene in the early to mid-90s. But that being said, they have definitely become one of my favorite bands in recent years, as I've dove very deeply into their back catalog within the past two, and seeing them return with any single at all is of course going to put a smile on my face, but a single this strong puts an even bigger smile on my face, especially when I got the chance to see them play it live at Fest back in October of 2023. And if you're a fan of the Lawrence Arms or Alkaline Trio, then I would definitely recommend giving this single a listen. And like I said in the beginning, I also of course would like to give a few shoutouts to some of my favorite locals here in Seattle: Dead Streets and their EP Hello Catastrophe, the Heart Smashers and their single Another Earth, Big Time and their two singles Bonktown and Whiskers, Kids on Fire and their full-length The Best of the Worst Times, and Well Adjusted and their EP Between the Barriers. I'm not going to give these too much background information here just for the sake of time, but all of these are definitely worth a listen, and I've seen all 5 of these bands more times than I can count, so I can confirm they deliver on all fronts. And finally, the number 1 spot on my top 10 releases of 2023 list goes to the band Versus the World and their full-length record, The Bastards Live Forever. Versus the World is a skate punk / pop punk band from Santa Barbara, California, and they're a little bit of a supergroup now, featuring both Chris Flippin from Lagwagon on lead guitar and Josh Lewis from the Bomb Pops on drums. This record made its first appearance back in May of 2023, and that was also right around the time Diesel Boy did our first couple of shows with these guys, which we would continue to do over the course of 2023. But regardless of any kind of biases I may have because of that, musically speaking alone, I absolutely love this album. It's full of brilliantly written, high-energy songs, a lot of really well-thought-out lyrics, some very striking guitar leads that often have a tendency to be just as catchy as some of the vocal melodies, and truthfully, some of the best-written choruses I think we've gotten from punk all year. Now, Versus the World are a little bit of a veteran band, and they've been at it since the mid-2000s, making their first debut in 2005. And while they certainly have a list of really solid releases behind them, truth be told, I think this is the best release we've ever gotten from them. And for as many great songs as we've had over the years, The Bastards Live Forever has a number of really stand-out tracks that make it feel like the band reached a new level with their songwriting. And on the subject of their songwriting, this record also has quite a bit of variety going on with it, with its influences ranging from, of course, 90s skate punk to 80s metal to early 2000s emo. And while I certainly think that's always been a part of Versus the World, I feel like we really see it shine here. And because of how perfectly melded together this variety package is and how strong all these songs are, I think this album has the capacity to go over pretty well with a variety of different audiences. And if you're a fan of anyone from Lagwagon to Brand New to The Descendants to The Wonder Years, then I would highly recommend checking The Bastards Live Forever out. Links to all of these releases, including the honorable mentions, can all be found in the description below, along with my 2023 faves playlist, which includes everything I talked about in this video and much more. But that is of course enough for me. I want to hear what you guys have to say. What are your favorite releases of 2023? Are you a fan of any of these that I had on my list? And if so, which ones? Let me know in the comments. Thanks a lot for watching. I'll see you next time.
This shit you suck, I can't believe we'll luck you haven't